Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that literally half the population has dealt with since the dawn of humanity, yet somehow remains shrouded in silence and mystery. We're talking about menstruation in ancient history. How did women throughout the ages manage their periods when there were no tampons, no pads, no period tracking apps, and definitely no discreet purple packaging? This is a story that's been whispered about, avoided, stigmatized, and buried for thousands of years. But it's also a story of ingenuity, resilience, and the quiet ways women have navigated one of humanity's most natural processes in societies that often pretended it didn't exist. So settle in. Maybe grab some tea, and let's talk about something that's been taboo for far too long. Because the history of menstruation isn't just women's history, it's human history. And it's time we stopped pretending periods began with the invention of modern hygiene products. Here's the first thing you need to understand about researching menstruation in ancient history. Nobody wrote about it. At least, not in the way they wrote about wars, kings, or philosophical debates. Menstruation was considered private, embarrassing, or in many cultures, religiously impure. So while we have thousands of texts about battle tactics and political intrigue, we have precious little direct evidence about how half the population managed a biological function that occurred every month for roughly 40 years of their lives. Think about that for a moment. Ancient historians meticulously documented everything from grain prices to the architecture of public baths. But menstruation? Silence. Not because it didn't happen, not because it wasn't important, but because women's bodies and their everyday realities were considered unworthy of historical record. What we do know comes from fragments. Archaeological evidence, mostly. Medical texts written by male physicians who had never experienced menstruation themselves. Religious laws that dictated how unclean women should be treated. And occasionally, beautifully, frustratingly rare glimpses from women's own voices, preserved in letters, poetry, or private documents. The archaeological record is equally challenging. Unlike pottery or metal tools that survived millennia, the materials women used for menstruation were organic. Cloth, wool, papyrus reeds, moss, animal skins. All of it biodegrades. All of it returns to dust. So we're left piecing together this history, like detectives examining a crime scene where most of the evidence has long since vanished. But here's what we do know. Women have been menstruating for as long as humans have existed, and they've been dealing with it, managing it, and continuing their lives despite societies that often treated their periods as shameful, dangerous, or spiritually contaminating. Let's start at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as we can get. Imagine being a woman in the Paleolithic era, somewhere around 30,000 BCE. You're living in a cave or a temporary shelter made of animal skins and wooden poles. Your daily life revolves around survival, gathering plants, preparing food, tanning hides, caring for children, and moving with your tribe as seasons change and resources shift. And then you get your period. What do? There's no pharmacy, no convenience store, no older sister to discreetly slip you supplies. Just you, your body, and whatever materials you can find in nature. Here's what anthropologists believe happened. Women likely used whatever soft, absorbent materials were available. Animal skins, carefully prepared and softened. Strips of leather. Moss, which is naturally absorbent and was used by many indigenous cultures well into the modern era. Wads of grass or plant fibers. And probably, frequently, they just let it flow. We tend to forget that for most of human history, people wore much less clothing than we do now, especially in warmer climates. A loose animal skin wrapped around the waist isn't exactly going to contain menstrual flow. And in societies where everyone slept communally on the ground, where there was no such thing as personal hygiene as we understand it, menstrual blood was just another bodily fluid in a life filled with them. But here's where it gets interesting. Paleolithic women probably didn't menstruate as frequently as modern women do. Why? because they were either pregnant or breastfeeding for most of their reproductive years. Think about the math. A Paleolithic woman would likely start menstruating around age 16, later than modern girls due to nutrition. She'd probably have her first child within a year or two. Then she'd breastfeed that child for 3 to 4 years, which often delays the return of menstruation. As soon as her period returned, she'd likely become pregnant again. This cycle would continue until menopause, which arrived earlier than it does now, possibly around age 40 if she survived that long. Anthropologist Beverly Strassman studied the Dogon people of Mali, one of the few remaining societies that live similarly to our prehistoric ancestors. Dogon women have an average of only about 100 periods in their entire lifetime, compared to the 400 to 500 that modern Western women experience. The constant cycle of pregnancy and extended breastfeeding meant that for our ancestors, menstruation was actually a relatively rare event. Still, when it did happen, women needed to deal with it. And the most likely solution was what's called free bleeding, which sounds very 21st century feminist, but is actually humanity's oldest menstrual management technique. Women simply bled into their clothing or onto the ground, washing themselves and their garments when possible. But even in prehistoric times, there were social consequences. Archaeological evidence suggests that many early societies had menstrual huts or designated spaces where menstruating women were separated from the rest of the community. Scholars debate whether this was about shame or practicality, protection or punishment. But one thing is clear. Even our earliest ancestors recognized menstruation as something significant, something that required acknowledgement, even if they didn't understand the biology behind it. Fast forward several thousand years to ancient Egypt, one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. Surely here, in a society that built pyramids, developed complex mathematics, and created elaborate beauty rituals, women had better options for managing menstruation. Right? Well, yes and no. Ancient Egyptian women had access to linen, one of the finest fabrics of the ancient world. Linen is breathable, absorbent, and relatively comfortable against the skin. Egyptian women almost certainly used strips of linen as menstrual cloths, similar to how women would use cloth pads well into the 20th century. These cloths would be folded into thick pads, held in place by a linen belt or girdle tied around the waist, and washed and reused month after month. For wealthier women, these might be made from fine, soft linen. For poorer women, coarser fabric would have to do. But the principle was the same. Absorb the blood, wash the cloth, repeat. We know this not from the cloths themselves, which have long since deteriorated, but from medical papyri, tomb paintings, and archaeological evidence of ancient textiles. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest preserved medical documents dating to around 1550 BCE, contains numerous remedies for menstrual problems, suggesting that Egyptians were very much aware of and concerned about women's reproductive health. But here's where things get uncomfortable. While Egyptian women may have had practical solutions for managing their periods, they also lived in a society that viewed menstruation through a religious lens. Menstrual blood was considered ritually impure. Women during their periods were not allowed to enter temples or participate in religious ceremonies. They were not permitted to prepare certain foods or engage in sexual relations. Some scholars suggest that Egyptian women may have worn specific amulets during menstruation, both for protection and as a visible sign of their impure state. Others point to evidence of menstrual huts or separate living quarters where women would retreat during their periods. Yet we also have evidence that Egyptian women worked as priestesses, physicians, and even pharaohs. Cleopatra ruled an empire. Hatshepsut reigned as pharaoh for over 2 decades. These women menstruated, certainly, but they didn't let it stop them from wielding enormous power. The contradiction tells us something important. Women have always found ways to navigate their periods, even in societies that tried to limit them because of menstruation. The practical reality of managing monthly bleeding coexisted uneasily with religious taboos and social restrictions. And Egyptian women weren't passive in this. Medical texts show that they developed their own remedies for menstrual cramps, heavy bleeding, and irregular cycles. Recipes included ingredients like dates, honey, and various herbs. Some remedies sound reasonable by modern standards. Others, like inserting crocodile dung into the vagina as a form of birth control, make us grateful for modern medicine. Ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, theater, and the Olympic Games. It also gave us some of the most bizarre medical theories about menstruation ever conceived. Let's start with Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine. You might think his oath and his emphasis on observation and reason would lead to accurate understanding of women's bodies. You would be wrong. Hippocrates and his followers believed that menstruation was the body's way of purging excess blood and bad humors. Women, they thought, were naturally wetter and colder than men. Yes, really. And menstruation was necessary to release this excess moisture. If a woman didn't menstruate regularly, the retained blood would supposedly wander around her body, causing all sorts of problems: hysteria, suffocation, madness. In fact, the Greeks believed that the uterus itself could wander around inside a woman's body like some kind of internal nomad, causing chaos wherever it went. This wandering womb theory persisted for centuries and was used to explain everything from anxiety to seizures to any behavior men found inexplicable in women. The treatment? Well, if your womb was wandering up toward your chest, doctors recommended placing pleasant-smelling substances near your vagina to lure it back down, and foul-smelling substances near your nose to drive it away from your upper body. I'm not making this up. This was legitimate medical advice from some of history's most respected physicians. But back to the practical question: how did Greek women manage their periods? Like Egyptian women, they likely used cloth. Greek clothing consisted of loose, draped garments called chitons and himaions, which would have made it relatively easy to wear cloth pads held in place by a belt or tied strips of fabric. Wealthier women might have had access to finer, softer cloths. Poorer women made do with whatever they could find. We also have evidence that Greek women used sea sponges as an absorbent material. Sponges were harvested from the Mediterranean and used for various purposes, including bathing and cleaning. It's not difficult to imagine enterprising women discovering that a small piece of damp sea sponge inserted into the vagina could absorb menstrual blood much like a modern tampon. In fact, this practice was well documented in later periods and may have originated in ancient Greece. Sponges had the advantage of being reusable, relatively comfortable, and discreet. The disadvantage? They needed to be cleaned thoroughly between uses, and in an era before germ theory, this could lead to infections. Greek women also dealt with the same religious restrictions as their Egyptian sisters. Menstruating women were considered polluted and were barred from temples and religious ceremonies. The Greek historian Plutarch wrote about menstrual taboos, though he questioned whether they were truly necessary, showing that even in ancient times, some people recognized these restrictions as social constructs rather than divine law. But here's what's fascinating. Despite being excluded from formal religious spaces, Greek women had their own religious festivals and rituals. The Thesmophoria, a festival honoring Demeter and Persephone, was exclusively for women. Men were barred from attending or even learning what happened during the ceremonies. Did menstruating women attend? We don't know for sure, but some scholars suggest that these women-only spaces may have been more accepting of menstruation than male-dominated religious institutions. Perhaps the Thesmophoria was a time when women didn't have to hide their periods or feel ashamed of their bodies. The Romans inherited much of their culture from the Greeks, including, unfortunately, many of their misconceptions about women's bodies. But they also added their own unique twist to menstrual mythology. Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman naturalist who died in 79 CE, while observing the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, had quite a lot to say about menstruation in his encyclopedia Natural History, and none of it was good. According to Pliny, Menstrual blood was so powerful and so toxic that it could turn wine sour, make crops wither, kill bees, rust iron, make dogs go mad if they ate food touched by menstruating women, cause mirrors to dim, blunt razors and knives, make mares miscarry. He wrote, "Nothing could easily be found that is more remarkable than the monthly flux of women. Contact with it turns new wine sour. Crops touched by it become barren, grafts die, seeds in gardens are dried up, the fruit of trees falls off." This wasn't fringe belief. This was mainstream Roman thought, documented by one of their most respected scholars. Menstruation was seen as literally toxic, a dangerous force that had to be contained and controlled. Yet despite these fears, Roman women still had to manage their periods practically. And we have more evidence from Rome than from earlier civilizations about exactly how they did it. Roman women used cloth pads called subligacillum, or subligar. These were essentially strips of cloth worn as a kind of loincloth or underwear, held up by a belt. During menstruation, women would add extra layers of absorbent cloth to these garments. We know this from several sources. Archaeological excavations have uncovered examples of these ancient undergarments, though, of course, without any remaining menstrual stains. Roman writings occasionally mention them, usually in contexts involving laundry or clothing. And medical texts discuss various gynecological issues, implying that women were actively managing their menstrual health. Roman women also had access to public baths, which were important social spaces. But menstruating women were often barred from communal bathing, both for hygiene reasons and because of the religious taboo against menstrual blood contaminating shared water. This must have been socially isolating. Roman culture revolved around the baths. Business was conducted there, gossip was exchanged, social connections were maintained. Being excluded during menstruation meant missing out on important aspects of social and political life. Wealthier Roman women had private baths in their homes, which gave them more freedom. But for most women, menstruation meant a week of relative isolation each month. Roman medical texts also show increasing interest in controlling menstruation. Doctors prescribed various herbs and compounds to regulate periods, reduce cramping, or stop heavy bleeding. Some of these remedies were based on genuine observation and had real medical value. Others were pure superstition. But what is interesting is the sheer volume of medical writing devoted to menstruation and women's reproductive health. While Roman society may have viewed menstrual blood as dangerous and polluting, Roman physicians recognized that understanding and treating menstrual disorders was important for women's overall health. Let's journey east to ancient China, where medical understanding took a very different approach from the Western tradition. Instead of wandering wombs and toxic blood, Chinese medicine viewed menstruation through the lens of qi, vital energy, yin and yang, complementary forces, and the 5 elements. In traditional Chinese medicine, menstruation was seen as a natural part of a woman's qi cycle, a necessary release that maintained balance in the body. A healthy menstrual cycle indicated harmony between yin and yang. Irregular periods, painful periods, or absent periods were signs that something had disrupted this balance. This is a fundamentally different worldview from ancient Greece and Rome. Instead of viewing menstrual blood as toxic or polluting, Chinese medicine saw it as a natural process that could reveal information about a woman's overall health. That said, Chinese women still faced practical challenges managing their periods. What did they use? Historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that Chinese women used cloth pads, similar to women in other ancient civilizations. These were called yu jing dai, menstrual belt, and consisted of cloth strips held in place by a belt around the waist. But Chinese women also had access to paper much earlier than their Western counterparts. China invented paper around 100 CE, and within a few centuries, some women were using paper as a disposable menstrual product. Imagine that, disposable pads in ancient China, over 1,000 years before similar products became available in the West. Of course, Paper was expensive, so this option was primarily available to wealthier women. Most women continued using cloth pads that could be washed and reused. But the very existence of paper pads shows creative problem-solving and innovation in menstrual management. Chinese medical texts from various dynasties contain extensive discussions of menstruation. The Huangdi Neijing, Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, one of the foundational texts of Chinese medicine, discusses menstrual cycles, fertility, and women's health in detail. Unlike Western texts that often portrayed menstruation as a disorder or disease, Chinese texts treated it as a normal physiological process that deserved medical attention and care. Chinese women also had access to herbal remedies for menstrual problems. Dong Cai, Angelica sinensis, for example, has been used in Chinese medicine for thousands of years to regulate menstruation, reduce cramping, and treat various gynecological issues. Modern research has validated some of these traditional uses, showing that ancient Chinese medicine got some things remarkably right. But cultural attitudes toward menstruation in China were complex. While medical texts treated it as natural, religious and social customs still imposed restrictions on menstruating women. Buddhist and Taoist traditions contained prohibitions against women entering temples or participating in certain rituals during menstruation. Confucian ideals of female purity and propriety meant that menstruation was not discussed openly, especially not in mixed company. Yet we also have evidence of women's own writings about menstruation. Female poets occasionally alluded to their periods in verse, using euphemisms and nature metaphors. Letters between women sometimes mentioned menstrual concerns. These fragments give us rare glimpses into how women themselves thought about and experienced their periods, beyond what male medical writers recorded. Ancient India presents yet another perspective on menstruation, shaped by Hindu, Buddhist, and later Islamic traditions. The Indian subcontinent's approach to periods was deeply intertwined with concepts of ritual purity, spiritual practice, and social hierarchy. In ancient Hindu texts, menstrual blood was considered powerful but polluting. The Manusmriti laws of Manu, an ancient legal text dating to around 200 BCE to 200 CE, laid out specific rules for menstruating women. They were to be isolated from the household for the duration of their period, typically 3 to 4 days. During this time, they could not cook, touch sacred objects, participate in religious ceremonies, or have contact with men. This practice, called chowpadi, in some regions continued in various forms for centuries, and in some conservative communities persists. Today, though, it's now officially banned in countries like Nepal due to the dangers it poses to women's health and safety. But the isolation wasn't purely punitive. Some scholars argue that it also provided women with a necessary rest from their constant domestic labor. In a society where women were responsible for grinding grain, cooking all meals, fetching water, and caring for children, a few days of required rest each month might have been welcome, even if the religious reasoning behind it was problematic. Indian women used cloth pads, similar to women in other ancient societies. These were typically made from old saris or other cotton fabric, folded into thick pads and held in place with a cloth belt. The hot climate of most of India meant that these cloths could be washed and dried quickly, though the monsoon season presented challenges. Some regions of India also used plant materials. Banana leaves, for example, are naturally waterproof and could be used as a barrier layer beneath cloth pads. In forested areas, certain types of moss or soft bark might have been used by women with limited access to cloth. Ayurveda, India's traditional system of medicine, took a holistic approach to menstruation. Like Chinese medicine, it viewed periods as a natural process that could indicate overall health. Ayurvedic texts contain detailed descriptions of normal and abnormal menstruation, along with herbal remedies for various menstrual disorders. Ayurveda classified women as bodies according to dashas, constitutional types, and prescribed different treatments based on which dosha was out of balance. For example, Heavy bleeding might be treated with cooling herbs if it was attributed to excess pitta, fire element, or warming herbs if attributed to excess kapha, earth, and water elements. Some of these Ayurvedic remedies have stood the test of time. Ashwagandha, shatavari, and other herbs used in ancient India for women's reproductive health are still prescribed today, and modern research has begun to validate some of their traditional uses. But perhaps most interesting is the existence of goddess worship centered around menstruation. The Kamakha temple in Assam is dedicated to a goddess whose annual menstruation is celebrated with a major festival. During this time, the temple is closed for 3 days to honor the goddess's period, then reopens with great fanfare. This tradition, which continues today, represents a rare example of menstruation being treated as sacred rather than polluting. This contradiction, menstruation as both sacred and impure, captures something essential about how ancient societies grappled with women's bodies. Menstrual blood was powerful, mysterious, and fundamentally female in a way that made male-dominated societies deeply uncomfortable. Before European colonization, the Americas were home to hundreds of distinct indigenous cultures, each with their own understanding of menstruation. While we must be careful not to generalize across such diverse societies, certain patterns emerge from the historical and anthropological record. Many Native American tribes referred to menstruation as moon time, recognizing the connection between the lunar cycle and women's menstrual cycles. This wasn't superstition. The average menstrual cycle is about 28 days, remarkably close to the lunar month of 29.5 days. But different tribes had radically different attitudes toward menstruation. Some viewed it as a time of spiritual power, when women were at their most potent and could access special knowledge or abilities. In these cultures, menstrual seclusion wasn't punishment. It was sacred time set aside for spiritual practice, rest, and communion with other women. The Yurok people of Northern California, for example, believed that menstruating women were at the height of their spiritual power. Women would retreat to special moon lodges during their periods, not because they were unclean, but because they were so powerful that they needed to be separated from everyday concerns to focus on spiritual matters. Anthropologist Thomas Buckley, who studied Yurok culture extensively, found that menstrual seclusion was viewed positively by Yurok women themselves. It was a time for meditation, spiritual renewal, and freedom from domestic duties. The Moon Lodge was a space where women could share knowledge, tell stories, and strengthen bonds with each other. Other tribes had different practices. The Lakota, Cherokee, and many other nations also had moon lodges or menstrual huts, though the specific customs varied. Some required complete isolation. Others allowed women to gather together, but separate from men. Some lasted for the entire period, others only for the first day or two. What did indigenous American women use for menstrual absorption? The answer varied widely depending on geographic location and available resources. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic studies suggest moss, particularly sphagnum moss, which is naturally absorbent and has antimicrobial properties, soft grasses or sedges, animal skins, especially soft buckskin cedar bark, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where red cedar was abundant, buffalo or bison wool among plains tribes, cattail fluff in wetland areas. Many of these materials were remarkably effective. Sphagnum moss, for example, can absorb up to 20 times its weight in liquid and contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. It was used in various cultures around the world and was even used in medical bandages during World War I. Indigenous women's knowledge of local plants also extended to medicinal uses. Various tribes used herbs to treat menstrual cramps, regulate irregular periods, or manage heavy bleeding. Some of these remedies have been studied by modern researchers and found to contain compounds with genuine pharmacological effects. But it's important to note that European colonization disrupted these traditional practices. Missionaries and colonizers brought their own attitudes about menstruation as shameful and unclean. Indigenous women were often forced to abandon their traditional practices and adopt European customs, losing centuries of accumulated knowledge in the process. Today, many Native American communities are working to reclaim these traditional teachings about menstruation. Moon lodges are being revived, traditional medicines are being preserved and shared, and a new generation of indigenous women are learning to honor their periods as their ancestors did. This history matters because it reminds us that negative attitudes toward menstruation aren't universal or inevitable. They're cultural constructs that can be challenged and changed. Ancient Jewish law had extensive regulations regarding menstruation, codified in the Torah and expanded in the Talmud. The concept of nida, ritual impurity, governed how menstruating women were treated in Jewish communities for thousands of years and continues to influence Orthodox Jewish practice today. According to Leviticus, a menstruating woman was considered ritually impure for 7 days. During this time, anyone who touched her or anything she sat on also became impure. Sexual relations were strictly forbidden. At the end of the period, she was required to undergo ritual immersion in a mikveh, ritual bath, before resuming normal life. These laws were presented as religious obligations, divine commandments, rather than medical advice or social custom. And unlike some other ancient societies where menstrual taboos were occasionally questioned or varied by region, Jewish law created a remarkably consistent set of practices that were followed across the Jewish diaspora. But what were the practical implications? How did ancient Jewish women manage their periods under these restrictions? Like other women in the ancient Near East, they used cloth pads. Jewish law actually addresses this directly, with rabbinic discussions about the proper way to check these cloths for blood and how to distinguish menstrual blood from other types of discharge. The level of detail in these texts is both fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable to modern readers, but it shows that rabbis recognized the need for clear, practical guidance. The mikveh ritual is particularly interesting from a hygienic standpoint. While the stated purpose was spiritual purification, the practice of bathing in clean water at the end of menstruation had obvious health benefits. In an era when regular bathing was not universal, this religious obligation ensured that women practiced at least monthly hygiene. Some scholars have argued that niddah laws, despite their patriarchal origins, may have had unexpected benefits for women. The prohibition on sexual relations during and immediately after menstruation meant that women had periods of guaranteed rest from sexual demands. In societies where women had little power to refuse their husbands, this religious law provided a legitimate reason to say no. Others point out that these same laws reinforced ideas about women's bodies being inherently impure or contaminating, contributing to shame and stigma around menstruation that persists to this day. The fact that men who touched menstruating women became impure, but not vice versa, reveals the assumption that impurity flowed from female bodies into the male realm, not the other way around. Jewish medical texts from the ancient period also discuss menstruation, often blending religious law with practical health advice. The Talmud contains discussions about what constitutes normal versus abnormal bleeding, how to treat menstrual disorders, and when women should seek medical help. These texts show that even within a framework of ritual law, there was room for medical knowledge and practical concern for women's health. It's worth noting that practices varied considerably among different Jewish communities. Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, and other Jewish populations developed their own customs around menstruation while maintaining the core biblical laws. This diversity reminds us that even within a single religious tradition, there's room for different interpretations and practices. As Christianity and Islam emerged and spread across the ancient world, they brought new perspectives on menstruation, though in many ways they inherited and adapted older taboos from Judaism and the cultures they encountered. Early Christianity had a complicated relationship with menstruation. Jesus himself challenged menstrual taboos in the gospel story of the woman with chronic bleeding who touched his cloak and was healed. When she revealed what she had done, expecting punishment for making him ritually impure. Jesus praised her faith instead. This story suggested a more compassionate approach to women's bodies than was common in ancient Judaism. However, as Christianity became institutionalized, it absorbed many of the purity laws from its Jewish roots. Church fathers debated whether menstruating women should be allowed to take communion or enter churches. Opinions varied, but stricter interpretations often won out. By the medieval period, Christian Europe had developed elaborate menstrual taboos that would have been familiar to ancient Jewish communities. Christian women in the ancient Roman Empire and early medieval period managed their periods much as Roman women had before them. Cloth pads, social isolation during menstruation, and a general culture of shame around their natural bodily functions. The belief that menstruation was a curse, punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, dominated Christian thinking for centuries. Islam, emerging in 7th century Arabia, also addressed menstruation in its religious texts. The Quran and Hadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, contain rules about menstruation that bear some similarity to Jewish law, but with important differences. Islamic law prohibits menstruating women from praying, fasting, having sexual intercourse, and touching the Quran. Unlike Jewish law, however, there's no requirement for physical separation or isolation of menstruating women. They can participate in most aspects of daily life. They simply abstain from specific religious practices. After menstruation ends, Muslim women are required to perform ghusl, full-body ritual purification, before resuming prayer and other religious obligations. Like the Jewish mikvah, this practice ensured regular bathing and hygiene. Islamic medical scholars, building on Greek, Persian, and Indian medical knowledge, wrote extensively about menstruation. Physicians like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Al-Razi included detailed discussions of menstrual health in their medical encyclopedias. These texts were more scientifically sophisticated than most contemporary European writings and showed genuine concern for women's well-being. Muslim women in the ancient and medieval periods used cloth pads similar to women in other cultures. Wealthier women might have had access to silk or fine cotton, which was more comfortable than coarser fabrics. The emphasis on cleanliness and ritual purity in Islam may have encouraged better hygiene practices around menstruation, though again, we have limited direct evidence about women's daily experiences. One interesting development in Islamic culture was the hammam, public bath, which became an important social institution in Muslim societies. While menstruating women were subject to certain restrictions, the hammam provided a space where women could gather, maintain hygiene, and socialize away from male oversight. These baths became centers of women's culture and community. Now we're moving into medieval Europe, where things somehow managed to get even worse for menstruating women. The Middle Ages inherited all of Christianity, as anxieties about women as bodies, and cranked them up to 11. Remember how we talked about menstrual blood being considered powerful or polluting in ancient cultures? Medieval Europe took that concept and weaponized it. Medieval medical texts repeated and amplified the worst ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. According to medical authorities, menstrual blood wasn't just impure. It was actively toxic, capable of poisoning food and drink, killing plants and crops, causing leprosy in children conceived during menstruation, dimming mirrors, making wine turn to vinegar, causing rabies in dogs, rusting iron and steel, generating venomous creatures. One medieval text claimed that if a menstruating woman looked at a polished sword, the blade would immediately rust. Another insisted that menstrual blood could kill bees merely by proximity. The physician Albertus Magnus wrote that menstrual vapors were so toxic they could poison the air and sicken anyone who breathed it. But the church took it further. Menstruation wasn't just a medical problem. It was a spiritual one. It was Eve's curse, punishment for original sin, proof of women's inherent corruption. Menstruating women were barred from churches, couldn't take communion, and in some regions, couldn't even enter cemeteries for fear they'd contaminate consecrated ground. Some medieval texts suggested that menstruating women should wear red clothing as a warning to others, like a medieval version of a hazard sign. Others recommended that they avoid mirrors, fresh meat, pickling, and bread making. The idea was that their very presence could spoil food, break objects, and corrupt the purity of domestic spaces. So what did medieval women actually use to manage their periods in this hostile environment? The same thing women had been using for millennia: cloth. Medieval women wore linen undergarments called bries or chemises, and during menstruation, they added thick cloth pads held in place with belts or ties. These pads were called clouts in England, and washing them was a constant, uncomfortable chore. Here's where things get interesting from a practical standpoint. Medieval European women typically owned very few items of clothing. A peasant woman might have only 2 chemises, one to wear and one to wash. During menstruation, she'd need extra cloth for padding, which meant repurposing old linens, rags, or any soft fabric she could find. Wealthier women had more options. They could afford multiple sets of menstrual cloths and had servants to wash them. Some medieval inventories from noble households mention monthly cloths among the linens, confirming that yes, even queens and duchesses bled and needed absorbent materials. But here's the cruel part. While wealthy women had servants to handle the washing, poor women often had to wash their menstrual cloths in public rivers or communal washing areas. This was humiliating and exhausting work, made worse by the social stigma attached to menstruation. Medieval laundresses developed techniques for removing bloodstains using cold water, lye soap, and various herbs. But in winter, when water sources froze and indoor fires were precious, keeping menstrual cloths clean became a serious challenge. Some women simply wore the same stained cloths month after month, washing them infrequently because they had no other option. The shame surrounding menstruation also meant that women couldn't openly discuss their periods or ask for help managing them. Young girls received little instruction about what to expect. When menarche arrived, it was often frightening and confusing, with girls believing they were dying or had been cursed. Medieval medical texts written by male physicians prescribed various treatments for menstrual problems, but these remedies were rarely accessible to ordinary women. Bloodletting, ironically, given that menstruation is natural bloodletting, was recommended for excessive periods. Herbs like mugwort, pennyroyal, and rue were used to regulate cycles or induce menstruation, though some of these herbs were also abortifacients and could be dangerous. Convents present an interesting case study. Nuns living together in enclosed religious communities would have experienced menstrual synchrony, where women's cycles align when they spend significant time together. Medieval convent records occasionally mention provisions for women's necessities, which likely included menstrual cloths. But nuns also faced unique challenges. They were supposed to be pure, virginal brides of Christ. How did menstruation fit into that identity? Some religious texts suggested that holy women menstruated less frequently, or not at all, as if sanctity could somehow override biology. Of course, this wasn't true, but it created additional psychological burden for nuns who had to reconcile their physical reality with impossible spiritual ideals. Medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen wrote about women as bodies with more nuance and respect than male theologians typically did. Hildegard, who was abbess, composer, philosopher, and visionary, described menstruation as natural and necessary, part of God's design for women. Her writings offered a rare counterpoint to the dominant narrative of shame and pollution. But for most medieval women, menstruation remained a monthly ordeal marked by pain, stigma, and practical difficulties. They managed as best they could with limited resources, in societies that viewed their natural bodily functions as evidence of moral corruption. The Renaissance brought humanism, scientific inquiry, artistic innovation, and the rediscovery of classical learning. Surely this enlightened age would bring better understanding of menstruation, right? wrong. Very wrong. Renaissance physicians still relied heavily on ancient Greek and Roman texts, which meant they inherited all the same misconceptions about wandering wombs, toxic menstrual blood, and women's inherent coldness and wetness. If anything, Renaissance medicine doubled down on these ideas, producing elaborate theories about female physiology that were creative but completely inaccurate. Take the concept of suffocation of the mother, hysteria, which Renaissance doctors believed was caused by the uterus moving around inside the body. They prescribed marriage and pregnancy as cures, assuming that regular sexual intercourse and childbearing would keep the uterus anchored in place. For unmarried women suffering from menstrual disorders, doctors sometimes recommended what they delicately called pelvic massage, which was exactly what it sounds like, though they framed it as medical treatment rather than sexual activity. Renaissance anatomists began dissecting human bodies, including female bodies, which should have led to better understanding. Andreas Vesalius, the father of modern anatomy, published detailed illustrations of human organs in 1543. But even Vesalius got female reproductive anatomy wrong in significant ways, partly because he rarely had access to female cadavers, and partly because existing theory shaped what he thought he was seeing. What did Renaissance women use for menstruation? Still cloth. The fundamental technology hadn't changed in thousands of years. Women wore linen undergarments and used folded cloth pads, called napkins or rags, held in place with belts or pins. However, the Renaissance did see some innovations in undergarments. Drawers, early underpants, became more common among wealthy women, and these could be designed to hold menstrual pads more securely. Some historians suggest that the invention of buttons and hooks made it easier to create undergarments specifically designed for menstrual management. The Renaissance was also the age of exploration, and European contact with other cultures brought new awareness of different menstrual practices. Spanish conquistadors reported on Aztec and Incan practices with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Raiders returning from Asia brought stories of different approaches to women's health. But rather than learning from these diverse traditions, European writers typically used them as evidence of other cultures' supposed savagery or backwardness. One interesting development was the emergence of midwifery texts written for women by women. Midwives, like Louise Bourgeois in France, published books about pregnancy, childbirth, and women's health that included practical advice about menstruation. These texts were revolutionary because they took women's experiences seriously and offered guidance based on direct observation rather than ancient theory. But midwifery was also under attack during this period. The professionalization of medicine meant that male physicians increasingly claimed authority over women's bodies. Midwives were often accused of witchcraft, particularly if they had knowledge of herbs that could regulate menstruation or prevent pregnancy. The witch hunts of the Renaissance and early modern period specifically targeted women with medical knowledge, destroying centuries of accumulated wisdom about women's health. This brings us to a dark chapter, the connection between menstruation and witchcraft accusations. Women who menstruated irregularly or who didn't menstruate due to pregnancy, menopause, or medical conditions, or who menstruated heavily were all potentially suspect. Witch hunters believed that witches didn't menstruate normally because they had made pacts with the devil. Conversely, women with painful or heavy periods might be accused of being cursed or possessed. The Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, contained extensive discussion of women's bodies and sexuality, linking female physiology to moral corruption. While it doesn't focus specifically on menstruation, its overall message that women's bodies were sites of danger and evil certainly contributed to menstrual stigma. Thousands of women were tortured and executed during the witch hunts, and while accusations varied, the underlying theme was consistent. Female bodies and female knowledge were threatening to male authority. The persecution of wise women, healers, and midwives effectively criminalized women's traditional medical knowledge, including knowledge about managing menstruation. The 17th and 18th centuries brought the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Reason, empiricism, and progress were the watchwords of the age. Surely now, finally, science would demystify menstruation. And it did, sort of, very slowly, with a lot of resistance. The discovery of blood circulation by William Harvey in 1628 was a breakthrough that should have revolutionized understanding of menstruation. If blood circulated through the body via the heart and blood vessels, then the old theory of menstruation as purging excess blood didn't make sense. But old ideas die hard, and many physicians continued to teach that menstruation was necessary to expel impurities even after circulation was understood. The invention of the microscope opened up new possibilities for studying blood and bodily fluids. By the late 1600s, scientists were examining menstrual blood under microscopes and discovering that it wasn't fundamentally different from other blood. But again, scientific evidence was slow to overcome centuries of prejudice. Enlightenment philosophers debated women's nature and women's place in society. Some, like Mary Wollstonecraft in her A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, argued for women's equality and rationality. But even progressive thinkers often viewed menstruation as a weakness that limited women's capabilities. The argument went, if women are subject to monthly illness, how can they be trusted with important responsibilities? This logic was used to exclude women from education, professions, and political participation well into the 20th century. Menstruation became a justification for inequality, repackaged in pseudo-scientific language. Meanwhile, women were still managing their periods with cloth. The 18th century saw some improvements in fabric quality and availability. Cotton became more common and affordable, especially after the Industrial Revolution began mechanizing textile production. Cotton cloths were softer, more absorbent, and easier to wash than linen, making menstrual management somewhat less uncomfortable. Some women began using multiple layers of cloth, experimenting with different folding techniques to maximize absorption. Wealthier women might have had specially made menstrual belts with attached pouches to hold cloth pads in place. But these innovations remained private, rarely discussed, and never commercially produced. Each woman had to figure out solutions on her own or learn from female relatives and friends. The 18th century also saw the publication of more medical texts aimed at women themselves rather than just physicians. Books like Aristotle's masterpiece, which was not actually written by Aristotle and was often considered scandalous, included information about menstruation, reproduction, and women's health. These books circulated widely, passed hand to hand, read in secret, providing women with information that was otherwise difficult to access. But medical advice remained questionable. Doctors recommended rest during menstruation, but also cautioned against too much rest, which might cause blood to stagnate. They advised against cold water, but also against excessive warmth. Exercise was both beneficial and dangerous, depending on which physician you consulted. The reality was that medical science still didn't understand menstruation's actual physiological mechanisms, so advice was based more on theory than evidence. The 19th century was a time of dramatic contradiction. On one hand, Victorian society was obsessed with female purity, modesty, and propriety. Women weren't supposed to have bodies, let alone bodies that bled. On the other hand, industrialization and medical advances were creating conditions for genuine innovations in menstrual management. Victorian culture took menstrual shame to new heights. The word menstruation itself was considered too vulgar for polite conversation. Instead, people used euphemisms, monthly courses, the flowers, being unwell, the curse, or simply that time. Young girls often had no idea what menstruation was until their first period arrived, which must have been terrifying. Medical textbooks advised women to avoid exercise, excitement, education, and basically anything interesting during menstruation. The theory was that menstruation diverted blood flow from the brain to the reproductive organs, making intellectual activity dangerous. This pseudoscience was used to argue against higher education for women. Studying during menstruation, doctors claimed, could cause sterility, insanity, or death. Dr. Edward Clark, a Harvard professor, published an influential book in 1873 titled Sex and Education, arguing that education was physically harmful to women because it interfered with the development of their reproductive organs. His evidence? Anecdotes about female students who became ill. His solution? Women should rest completely during menstruation, which would make higher education impossible. This book was widely read and cited for decades as proof that women couldn't handle the same education as men. But here's where we finally see real innovation: the commercial sanitary napkin. For thousands of years, women had been making their own menstrual cloths. But in the 1890s, companies began manufacturing disposable menstrual pads. The inspiration came from an unexpected source: battlefield bandages. During the American Civil War and later conflicts, nurses noticed that the new absorbent cellulose bandages worked remarkably well for managing menstrual flow. After the war, some entrepreneurial companies realized they could adapt this technology for women's use. Johnson & Johnson introduced Lister's towels in 1896, one of the first mass-produced sanitary napkins. But marketing them was a challenge. Stores refused to stock them openly. Advertisements couldn't use direct language. Women were too embarrassed to ask for them. The product failed commercially, despite being a genuine innovation. The breakthrough came in 1920, when Kimberly Clark introduced Kotex pads. Kotex was made from cotton, a material developed for World War I bandages. The company realized that battlefield nurses had been using these bandages for menstruation and decided to market them to all women. But how do you advertise something that can't be mentioned in polite society? Kotex used discreet advertisements in women's magazines, focusing on hygiene and confidence without explicitly mentioning menstruation. They allowed women to purchase pads without speaking to a clerk by placing money in a box and taking the product from a counter display. This preserved the fiction that menstruation didn't exist, while actually providing women with a much-needed product. The introduction of disposable pads was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time in human history, women didn't have to wash and reuse menstrual cloths. They could simply dispose of used pads, though what to do with them remained a problem, especially in homes without indoor plumbing. Disposable pads were more absorbent, more reliable, and more convenient than anything that had come before. But they were also expensive. Early pads cost about 60 cents per box at a time, when many women earned only dollars per week. Poor women and rural women often couldn't afford them, and continued using homemade cloth pads well into the 20th century. The menstrual divide between rich and poor had always existed, but commercialization made it more visible. The Victorian era also saw the invention of the first menstrual belts and early tampons. A device called the menstrual cup was patented in the 1860s, though it didn't become commercially viable. These innovations show that women and inventors were actively working to solve menstrual management problems, even if society refused to acknowledge them publicly. The 20th century transformed menstrual management more than the previous 5,000 years combined. A combination of medical breakthroughs, women's liberation, commercial innovation, and changing social attitudes created the menstrual product industry we know today. Let's start with the medical side. In the early 1900s, scientists finally understood the hormonal mechanisms behind menstruation. The discovery of estrogen and progesterone, the identification of the menstrual cycle's phases, and the understanding of how the endometrium builds up and sheds each month, revolutionized gynecology. This knowledge led to treatments for menstrual disorders, the development of hormonal birth control, which could regulate or eliminate periods, and a more scientific approach to women's reproductive health. For the first time, doctors actually understood what they were treating. But understanding the biology didn't immediately eliminate stigma. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, menstruation remained a taboo topic. Sex education, when it existed at all, focused on reproduction and barely mentioned the practical aspects of managing periods. Girls learned through whispered conversations with mothers, sisters, or friends, if they learned at all. The evolution of menstrual products accelerated. 1930s. Tampons were invented and commercialized. Dr. Earl Haas patented the first modern tampon with an applicator in 1931, calling it Tampax. The idea of internal menstrual protection was revolutionary and controversial. Many people believed that tampons would damage virginity or encourage sexual activity. Some religious groups condemned them as immoral, but women who tried them were often converted immediately. The freedom of movement, the ability to swim, the absence of bulky pads, all made tampons incredibly appealing. 1940s, 1950s. During World War II, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and menstrual management became a practical workplace issue. Factories and offices had to provide facilities for women to change pads. The assumption that women should stay home during their periods became impossible to maintain when they were building airplanes and running businesses. 1960s, 1970s. The women's liberation movement changed everything. Feminists demanded that women's bodies and experiences be taken seriously. Books like Our Bodies, Ourselves discussed menstruation openly, demystifying it and connecting it to broader issues of women's autonomy and health. The social stigma around menstruation began to crack, at least in progressive circles. This era also saw significant product innovation. Adhesive strips replaced menstrual belts, making pads easier to use. Deodorant, tampons, and pads were introduced and later criticized for potentially causing irritation and infections. Variety expanded. Different sizes, different absorbencies, different styles to suit different needs and preferences. 1980s. The toxic shock syndrome, TSS, crisis revealed the dangers of superabsorbent tampons left in too long. Several women died, and many more became seriously ill. The incident led to better regulation, warning labels, and research into tampon safety. It was a reminder that menstrual products, despite being commercially produced, weren't always safe or well tested. 1990s, 2000s. The environmental movement raised questions about disposable menstrual products. A woman uses approximately 11,000 tampons or pads in her lifetime, all of which end up in landfills or sewage systems. This environmental cost, combined with concerns about chemicals in commercial products, led to a resurgence of interest in reusable options. The modern menstrual cup was introduced in the 1930s, but didn't gain popularity until the 2000s. Made from medical-grade silicone, menstrual cups can be worn for up to 12 hours, are reusable for years, and produce virtually no waste. They require an initial investment and a learning curve, but many women find them more comfortable and convenient than disposable products. Period underwear, cloth pads, and other reusable options also gained market share. Companies like Thinx, Dear Kate, and others developed underwear with built-in absorbent layers that could replace or supplement other products. These innovations combine modern materials science with the ancient practice of using cloth for menstruation. While the developed world was creating an abundance of menstrual product choices, much of the world's population still lacked access to basic supplies. This gap, known as period poverty, affects millions of people today and reveals how little has changed for many women despite thousands of years of history. According to UNICEF, roughly 1/3 of girls in South Asia have no menstrual protection at all. In sub-Saharan Africa, many girls miss up to 20% of the school year because they lack supplies to manage their periods. In Nepal, despite legal bans, some communities still practice chowpatty, exiling menstruating women to dangerous huts where they risk death from cold, smoke inhalation, or animal attacks. Even in wealthy countries, period poverty exists. A 2019 study found that 1 in 5 American teenagers struggled to afford menstrual products. Food banks rarely stock pads and tampons. Homeless women have virtually no access to menstrual supplies. Incarcerated women are often given inadequate supplies, sometimes rationed as a form of control. The economics of menstruation are staggering. A person who menstruates will spend an estimated $2,000 to $5,000 on menstrual products over their lifetime. In many countries, these products are taxed as luxury items rather than necessities, adding insult to injury. The tampon tax has become a rallying point for activists, arguing that menstrual products should be treated like toilet paper or soap as basic hygiene necessities. Some countries have made progress. Scotland became the first country to make menstrual products free and universally available in 2020. New Zealand eliminated the tampon tax. Several U.S. states have done the same. Schools and workplaces increasingly provide free menstrual products in bathrooms, recognizing that access is a matter of dignity and equality. But the cultural stigma persists globally. In many parts of India, menstruating women are still considered polluted and are excluded from temples, kitchens, and social activities. The 2018 documentary, Period, End of Sentence, highlighted how women in rural India couldn't even say the word period and had to use elaborate euphemisms. In some cultures, girls' first periods are celebrated with coming-of-age ceremonies. The Apache sunrise ceremony, Ghanaian Depo rituals, and similar traditions mark menarche as a transition to womanhood. These celebrations can be empowering, but they can also perpetuate child marriage and limit girls' futures by defining them primarily as potential mothers. The global picture reveals that menstrual management isn't just about products. It's about education, infrastructure, gender equality, and cultural change. Girls need clean water to wash reusable cloths. They need private bathrooms at school. They need education about their bodies before menarche arrives. They need societies that don't shame them for a natural biological process. Organizations like Days for Girls, the PAD Project, and Lunapads International are working to provide both menstrual products and education to communities lacking access. But the scale of the need is enormous. An estimated 500 million people worldwide lack adequate resources to manage their periods with dignity. Throughout most of history, menstruation was explained through mythology, religion, and flawed medical theory. Only in the late 19th and 20th centuries did science finally provide accurate understanding of what happens during a menstrual cycle. Here's what we now know that ancient women didn't. The menstrual cycle is controlled by a complex interplay of hormones produced by the brain, hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and ovaries. Follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, trigger the development and release of an egg. Estrogen and progesterone prepare the uterine lining to support a potential pregnancy. When pregnancy doesn't occur, hormone levels drop, causing the endometrium to shed, which is menstruation. This cycle typically lasts 28 days, but can range from 21 to 35 days and still be normal. The bleeding phase usually lasts 3 to 7 days. A typical period involves losing about 30 to 40 milliliters of blood, though it feels like much more. We also now understand menstrual disorders. Dysmenorrhea, painful periods, is caused by prostaglandins, hormone-like chemicals that cause uterine contractions. For centuries, women's pain was dismissed as psychological or moral weakness. Now we know it's a real physiological process, and we have treatments. Menorrhagia, heavy bleeding, can be caused by hormonal imbalances, fibroids, polyps, or clotting disorders. Ancient women with this condition often became severely anemic, which could be fatal. Today, it's treatable. Amenorrhea, absence of periods, can result from pregnancy, breastfeeding, stress, excessive exercise, eating disorders, or medical conditions. Ancient societies often viewed this as a sign of disease or moral failing. We now know the causes are varied and often treatable. Premenstrual syndrome, PMS, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, are real hormonal conditions, not character flaws. The mood changes, pain, and other symptoms that women experience before menstruation have biological causes. Modern research has also revealed interesting facts about menstruation across the lifespan. The average age of menarche, first period, has been dropping in developed countries. In the 1800s, girls typically started menstruating around age 16 to 17. Today, the average is 12 to 13. Better nutrition and higher body weight in childhood trigger earlier puberty. This means modern women menstruate for many more years than their ancestors. Combined with fewer pregnancies and shorter breastfeeding periods, contemporary women have vastly more menstrual cycles than any previous generation in human history. We've also learned about menstrual synchrony, a phenomenon where women living together tend to align their cycles. College roommates, family members, and close friends often report synchronized periods. The scientific evidence for this is mixed, but many women report experiencing it. Research has revealed connections between menstruation and other aspects of health. The menstrual cycle affects pain tolerance, varies across the cycle. Immune system function, stronger in the follicular phase. Athletic performance, some athletes perform better at certain cycle points. Mental health. Hormonal fluctuations can affect mood and anxiety. Metabolism and appetite. Cravings before periods are real. This knowledge validates what women have known experientially for millennia. Menstruation affects the whole body, not just the reproductive system. Ancient women who reported pain, fatigue, or mood changes weren't imagining things or being weak. They were experiencing real physiological effects. After thousands of years of shame, silence, and stigma, we're finally seeing a global movement to normalize menstruation. Social media, activism, and changing attitudes are transforming how periods are discussed and experienced. The hashtag period pride and hashtag end period poverty movements have made menstruation a mainstream topic. Athletes discuss competing during their periods. Politicians advocate for menstrual equity. Artists create period-positive work. The silence is breaking. In 2015, Kiran Gandhi ran the London Marathon while free-bleeding to protest period stigma. Her action sparked global conversation. Some called it disgusting. Others called it revolutionary. But either way, people were talking about menstruation in public, which was itself a victory. Instagram and TikTok have become platforms for period education. Young people share information about menstrual products, managing cramps, and navigating period stigma. What previous generations learned through whispered conversations, today's youth learn through hashtags and viral videos. The menstrual product industry has exploded with innovation. Smart period tracking. Apps use algorithms to predict cycles, though privacy concerns have emerged about companies collecting intimate health data. Organic products. Cotton tampons and pads without chemicals, dyes, or fragrances menstrual discs. Alternatives to cups that sit differently in the vaginal canal heating pads and tech. USB-powered heating devices for cramps period-proof clothing. Beyond underwear to swimwear and athletic wear. But perhaps most importantly, we're seeing a shift in how menstruation is conceptualized. Instead of being a curse, illness, or source of shame, periods are being reframed as a normal bodily function, a sign of health, even a source of power. The body positivity and feminist movements have reclaimed menstruation as part of women's experience that shouldn't be hidden or apologized for. Books, art, and advocacy celebrate the menstruating body rather than treating it as inherently problematic. Medical research is finally prioritizing women's health. For most of medical history, studies focused on male bodies and assumed findings would apply to women. We now know this is false. Menstrual health research is revealing how hormonal cycles affect everything from drug efficacy to disease presentation to athletic performance. There's also growing recognition of transgender and non-binary people who menstruate. The language around menstruation is expanding to be more inclusive people who menstruate rather than just women. This change has been controversial, but reflects a more nuanced understanding of gender and biology. Looking forward, what might the future of menstrual management look like? Menstrual suppression. Birth control methods that eliminate periods entirely are becoming more popular. Some people choose to skip periods indefinitely using continuous hormonal contraception. The medical consensus is that this is safe for most people, though cultural attitudes about natural cycles remain mixed. Medical innovation. Research into endometriosis, PCOS, and other menstrual disorders is advancing. New treatments could dramatically improve quality of life for millions of people who suffer from painful or problematic periods. Sustainable solutions. As environmental consciousness grows, more people are switching to reusable products. Future innovations might include biodegradable disposables or even more advanced reusable technologies. Menstrual leave. Some countries and companies now offer menstrual leave, allowing people to take paid time off during especially painful periods. Critics argue this could reinforce discrimination. Supporters say it acknowledges biological reality and promotes well-being. Artificial wombs. While still largely science fiction, research into artificial gestation could eventually mean that menstruation becomes optional for those who don't want children, as the reproductive system's function could be bypassed entirely. Looking back across thousands of years of menstrual history, what stands out isn't just how management techniques evolved. It's what we lost along the way and what we're trying to regain. Ancient and indigenous cultures had knowledge that we're only now rediscovering. They understood which plants could ease cramps, regulate cycles, and support women's health. Much of this knowledge was destroyed during colonization, medicalization, and the persecution of women healers. Traditional practices like the Moon Lodge, when not forced isolation but chosen community time, offered something valuable: space for women to rest, share experiences, and connect with their bodies away from the demands of daily life. Modern women are recreating these spaces through red tents, women's circles, and menstrual retreats, recognizing that there was wisdom in setting aside time for reflection and rest during menstruation. We've also lost the diversity of menstrual experiences that existed across cultures. The global spread of Western medical models and commercial products has created more uniformity but less cultural creativity in how menstruation is understood and managed. What have we gained? Obviously, the practical improvements are enormous. Modern menstrual products are more effective, convenient, and hygienic than anything available to our ancestors. Medical understanding means we can treat disorders and prevent suffering. Legal protections and menstrual equity initiatives are expanding access. But perhaps most importantly, we've gained the ability to talk about menstruation. The silence that oppressed women for millennia is breaking. Young people are growing up in a world where periods can be discussed openly, where menstrual health is recognized as important, where shame is being challenged. This doesn't mean we've achieved full acceptance. Period stigma persists globally. Many people still hide their menstruation, feel embarrassed buying products, or believe their periods make them weak or unclean. But the trajectory is toward openness, education, and normalization. Here's the thing about menstrual history. It's not finished. Right now, today, millions of people are menstruating, managing their periods with varying degrees of difficulty, access, and support. The history we've traced from prehistoric caves to modern boardrooms is still being written. Some things have improved dramatically. A woman today has options her great-grandmother couldn't have imagined. She can suppress her period entirely if she chooses. She can track her cycle with an app. She can buy products designed for her specific needs. She might even work somewhere that provides free supplies and accepts menstrual leave. But other things remain stubbornly unchanged. Period poverty affects people in every country. Stigma persists in many cultures. Young girls still experience confusion and shame at menarche. Menstrual disorders often go undiagnosed or untreated. Transgender men and non-binary people who menstruate face additional challenges navigating a gendered experience that doesn't match their identity. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed ongoing vulnerabilities. Lockdowns disrupted supply chains, making menstrual products scarce in some regions. Economic hardship pushed more people into period poverty. School closures meant girls couldn't access supplies provided at school. A pandemic showed how fragile menstrual access really is. Climate change threatens menstrual equity in new ways. Extreme weather disrupts supply chains. Water scarcity makes washing reusable products difficult. Displacement from climate disasters means refugees and displaced people lack access to supplies. Environmental degradation affects the materials used in menstrual products. But there's also reason for optimism. More people are advocating for menstrual equity than ever before. Research funding for women's health is increasing. Social attitudes are shifting, particularly among younger generations. The conversation has changed from whether we should discuss menstruation to how we can best support people who menstruate. Technology offers new possibilities. Menstrual tracking apps, while imperfect, help people understand their cycles. Online communities provide support and information. Social media platforms, despite their flaws, allow people to share experiences and organize for change. The fight for menstrual equity is part of larger struggles for gender equality, economic justice, and human dignity. When we ensure that everyone has access to menstrual products, education, and healthcare, we're not just solving a practical problem. We're affirming that people who menstruate deserve respect, support, and full participation in society. So what have we learned from this journey through menstrual history? First, that women have always been resourceful. From Paleolithic moss to Victorian cloth pads to modern menstrual cups, people who menstruate have consistently figured out solutions to a practical problem, often despite societies that refuse to acknowledge it. Second, that menstrual shame is cultural, not biological. The stigma surrounding periods varies dramatically across time and place. It's not an inevitable result of menstruation itself, but a social construct that can be challenged and changed. Third, that silence serves power. When menstruation can't be discussed, people who menstruate can't advocate for their needs, share solutions, or demand better treatment. Breaking the silence is itself a revolutionary act. Fourth, that menstrual management is connected to larger issues of equality, health, education, and dignity. You can't separate periods from gender, class, race, disability, or any other aspect of identity. Menstrual justice is social justice. Fifth, that we've come an astonishingly long way, and we still have far to go. The distance from prehistoric free bleeding to modern menstrual cups is vast, but millions of people still lack basic supplies and face discrimination because they menstruate. Finally, that every person who has ever managed their period is part of this history. Your grandmother washing cloth pads in cold water. Your mother navigating the arrival of disposable products. You choosing between tampons, pads, cups, or period underwear. All of it is part of the ongoing story of how humans have dealt with menstruation. The next chapter is being written right now. What will it contain? Universal access to menstrual products? Complete normalization of period discussions? Medical breakthroughs that eliminate menstrual disorders? Or will we still be fighting the same battles over stigma, poverty, and equity? That depends on us, on continuing to break the silence, on demanding better research, better products, better policies, on teaching the next generation that menstruation is normal, natural, and nothing to be ashamed of. For thousands of years, women managed their periods in silence, shame, and isolation. They made do with whatever materials they could find, endured pain without treatment, and carried on despite societies that treated their bodies as problems to be solved or threats to be contained. They deserve better. and so do you. The history of menstruation is really the history of half the human population trying to live their lives while dealing with a biological function that society refused to accommodate. It's a history of resilience, ingenuity, and perseverance in the face of stigma and neglect. But it's also a history that's changing. Every conversation about periods, every menstrual product donation, every policy change, every research study contributes to a future where menstruation is treated with the respect and attention it deserves. So the next time you unwrap a tampon or pad, remember, you're part of a story that stretches back to the dawn of humanity. You're using technology that women fought for, advocated for, and sometimes invented themselves. You're living in a time when, for the first time in history, menstruation can be discussed openly and managed effectively. We're not at the end of menstrual history. We're in the middle of it, and the ending hasn't been written yet. Make it a good one.